In this second section, we're going to look at how to perform operations with those complex numbers. And we're not going to look at all the operations because we've actually already done adding and subtracting, but we are going to look at how to multiply and divide with complex numbers. So first, as a reminder from the last section, I told you that we frequently use the variable z to represent a complex number, whether it's in the a plus bi form or in the new form we're learning, the polar / trig form, r cosine theta plus I sine of theta. Now, since we have two different complex numbers, you'll notice that we have a subscript of 1. So they're saying for the first complex number, there's an r value and a theta value associated with that. And then you have a second complex number, which has its own r value and theta value. So that's how they distinguish between the first complex number and the second complex number. First, let's look at the multiplication process. If you have two different complex numbers and you are asked to multiply them together, then this is saying that you need to multiply those two r values. If you write no sign in between two variables like x, y, that means multiply x and y. So the same thing is being indicated here. Take the r value from the first one and the r value from the second one, multiply them together. Then you still have a cosine of theta part, but your theta value is going to be the sum of the two angles, the angle from the first complex number and the angle from the second complex number. And then it's that same answer in both places. So you only have to add the two angles from the two complex numbers once, and then use that theta value twice in these two locations, basically. So to recap, multiply two complex numbers, multiply the r values, add the angles. That's it. So let's look at an example. You'll have some questions that look like this on MATLAB. And like I said, we need to multiply the two r values. So in this case, 6 times 7 would be 42. And then in parentheses, you still have cosine of, and then we're adding the two theta values. So we have 128 and 116, which is going to add up to 244 degrees. Now that angle gets used twice because it's also I times sine of that angle. But that means I'm looking for an answer in this form, 42 times cosine of 244 plus I sine of 244. Now, since this is multiple choice, it should be pretty easy to find the answer that matches this. Just make sure that you do notice some of them are doing something tricky, like this one didn't have the I value in it. So you actually need the 42 cosine of 244 plus I sine of 244. I'm not going to actually walk through this example, but for some of them, just be aware they will give you the angle as a radian measurement. You're still doing the same thing. You need to multiply the two r values and add the two theta values, but you have to remember how to add fractions. Make sure you get a common denominator, then combine them and do any simplifying if possible. Instead, I'm going to jump on to the next operation you'll be looking at, which is how do you do division of complex numbers. So for this, let's look back at the notes. When you have one complex number divided by another complex number, then you divide the two r values. So for the one on top, take that r value and divide it by the r value from the one on the bottom. And for the theta values, very similar to what we did with multiplication, you're just going to subtract the two angles. Make sure you're doing the angle from the first complex number, the one that's in the numerator, and then you're subtracting the one from the denominator. The order on that does matter, so it has to be the one on top minus the one from the bottom. So now let's look at the example with this. Here I can see that the r values on the top and the bottom, we have 16 and 2. Well, if you actually reduce 16 and 2, that would equal 8. And then when I'm figuring out what goes inside for the theta values, I know it's going to be cosine of theta. My theta value is going to come from subtracting the one on top minus the one on the bottom. So 140 minus 80 is going to equal 60. And then that angle gets used twice, so it's also going to be plus I sine of 60. You should never have different angles for the cosine and the sine part, so just make sure that those numbers always match. Now in this case, it's not multiple choice, they want us to type in the answer, so just go ahead and make sure you're careful not accidentally hitting any spaces or anything in there. And you're done. It's a pretty simple operation. It looks hideous, but you're really just doing a real quick division and subtraction problem. Some of them will, of course, have radian measurements instead on there. And if that happens, just make sure that you remember for adding and subtracting that you will in fact need to get common denominators to perform those operations. So here you can see that you have 2 pi and you're going to have to subtract 3 pi over 2. So get a common denominator, make sure you reduce them. And that's all for the assignment you guys will be doing. So I hope that was helpful.